You're listening to Strictly Business Podcast with Lindsay Williams.
Several years ago, I spoke to Alex Crawford from Sky News. I asked her to come to Cape Town and talk to me about her experiences in Libya and other matters as well. She agreed to do so, and we had a fascinating afternoon and a fascinating interview. She was the first journalist to go into Colonel Gaddafi's Tripoli compound, his lavish Tripoli compound, and she reported upon those extraordinary events with me. Here's this from the strictlybusinesspodcast.com archives. I was going to come up with a highly convoluted introduction to my next guest, but then I read her CV and I read her recent achievements and I read through all the recent press clippings from newspapers around the world about her achievements, and I thought, well, that's half the interview gone already. So all I'm going to do is say in the studio with me is the world's most famous journalist. It's Alex Crawford from Sky News. Alex, thanks so much for popping down to Cape Town just to see us. We feel very honoured. There's so much to talk about, but let's start with the most recent stuff. What made you go into Tripoli with the rebels when people from the BBC and everyone else was holed up in the Rixon Hotel drinking Red Bull and eating pistachios?
Well, I never saw any of them very late on. I saw them earlier on in the day, and I don't know why they didn't go in. I think maybe we were in the right place. It was certainly, the timing was absolutely spot on because we managed to coincide with a whole group of a big convoy from Misrata, who were obviously very well tooled up. They were extremely determined, and they were heading into Tripoli that night, whatever happened. And we tagged along with them, and it just felt like the right thing to do. We were really just following our noses.
So it was instinct. I mean, the same sort of instinct that said, yes, come down to Cape Town and have a chat with Newscape. The same sort of instinct said, yes, we should go into Tripoli now. But there were dangers. You were fearful that perhaps the Gaddafi forces would be there to repel the rebels. But eventually that, of course, didn't occur.
I think there were obvious dangers. I mean, even the rebel soldiers, the civilians who tagged along with them, were all very edgy and very fearful about what was in front of them. And it just never transpired. And I think they were as stunned as we were when we arrived in Tripoli, and there wasn't this mighty force. There were no Gaddafi army. There were no Gaddafi people at all. They were all very welcoming of this rebel army that was coming into town.
And that relief, of course, manifested itself in extreme joy. I mean, I've said before on this show that I've never seen such joy, such ecstasy, such relief. I mean, years and years and years of oppression, plus a couple of hours of realisation that there was no opposition, just came out in this flood of relief. And it was actually quite moving.
It was very moving. And I think it was very difficult not to get caught up with all the euphoria, because it was a wave. It was a tsunami of excitement and relief. You know, people, grown men were coming out. I have this particular vision of this man right in front of me now, coming up to the pickup truck that we were on, and he was very sweaty through, as everyone was that night, because it was very hot. It was 38, 40 degrees, and people were scared. Even the ones that were coming out onto the street didn't know whether this was going to work or not. You know, we were on the edges of Tripoli, just walking in, and driving in, and this man was crying with relief and throwing his arms round the soldiers, as did many people, and even women for the first time that I'd seen in the conflict were coming out, groups of them. I remember them all, a group of about 6 of them, all standing together dressed in their all black clothing, trilling, making this sort of noise with their, I can't do it, but in excitement and joy and welcome, because they were so excited to see this huge convoy. And it was a really, really big one, because there were so many vehicles. The entrance into Tripoli was gridlocked. We were hardly moving at all because there were so many vehicles and so many people coming out of their homes and their houses, even holding children. And this cacophony of noise, all this firing as they were sort of celebrating and announcing their arrival as well. And we'd first gone in and they'd shut off all the lights. None of the cars had lights. None of the street lights were on. Yeah. I don't know, because of power cuts or because someone had cut them off, but it was dark. And one of the cameramen tried to light a cigarette, and the soldiers said, no, turn, no lights, because they were quite worried about what was in front of them. And
Perhaps
then
snipers and seeing a light that they would be targeted.
All day we'd been encountering snipers in that 30-mile road from Zawiya to Tripoli. There'd been fights all the way along with, people being shot at and just they were fighting and being stopped by the snipers. But unbeknown to us, they've been pushed further and further back. They were retreating, basically. And I think that night they just left Green Square entirely.
How hated was Gaddafi? I mean, you saw this outpouring of emotion. He must have been a real terror.
I think he was hated and feared in equal measure. I mean, there was a huge amount of fear. Even when Zawiya had fallen, just a couple of days before Green Square in Tripoli went, people were too scared to go on television with it showing their faces. And when I was in Zawiya in March, I know that a number of people, after we'd interviewed them, were arrested, imprisoned. At least 5,000 people were rounded up in Zawiya itself. Whole families they used to go into people's houses and round them up, and then they would disappear into jails to be interrogated. There was a real fear of the regime, and I think that fear still exists as long as the key Gaddafi members of the family are not traced.
Yes, indeed. I mean, once they have been traced and once people realise that they are either not in Libya and therefore have no power or are dead, then the relief will be palpable. But of course, then the struggle for power starts. But that's a problem for the future. After you'd gone in with the rebels in those famous scenes where you had the helmet on and you said, I haven't got this helmet on, this crash helmet on, because I'm afraid of being shot. It's just because there's so much celebratory gunfire into the sky that the bullets can come down and cause me damage. After you'd done that and you'd gone into Tripoli, you met no resistance from the Gaddafi forces. Then was it the next day that the compound fell and you were the first journalist in there?
We went to bed very late that night. It was a Sunday night, and we went to bed very late because we'd been in Green Square. We had about a couple of hours sleep, and we ended up in the hospital that night because we left the square thinking that it was over, basically. There was so many people out on the streets. It was all very comfortable. We started heading back down the road, very short distance. In fact, we were heading towards the Rixos to try and see our colleagues there who'd been there for about 3 weeks.
Just to reiterate that the Rixos Hotel is the hotel where foreign journalists were housed and they could be monitored, I suppose, by the Gaddafi forces.
Yes, and there were still, unbeknown to me, there were still lots of Gaddafi minders there. But we thought we'd go and see them and see if they were all right. And en route, we stopped at the hospital because we saw some casualties arriving. And my cameraman, Gowan McCluckey, jumped out, ran inside to see what was going on. We stayed outside with our pickup truck because it was now our only transport out of there. And this firefight broke out outside the hospital. A man was shot in front of the hospital. 2 doctors were shot at inside the hospital quadrangle, and 1 doctor was shot through the head as he was taking a casualty in. So we ran ourselves inside of the hospital. The pickup truck disappeared, never saw it again, and we stayed in the hospital. When we woke up a couple of hours later, things were very, very different. The doctors were clearly very on edge. The situation had entirely changed, and it was very fragile. It was very insecure. There was shells were hitting the hospital walls that day. And people were terrified inside. They couldn't get supplies in and out, and things were very fragile. That night, Saif Gaddafi, Colonel Gaddafi's son, turned up at the Rixos, said they still had control of parts of the city, they still had loads of support, and that people should rally round them. And I think that propelled the opposition fighters to go onto the compound, which they did on Tuesday.
He addressed foreign journalists, didn't he?
Yeah, he gathered up the foreign journalists in the Rixos, took them back to the compound, delivered a speech where he had a body of people all waving green flags and said that they were still in control. Colonel Gaddafi was still in Libya and still very much in power, and that people should fight off these opposition fighters.
Right, after that, the compound story, because I know we've spoken earlier off air that you were there, and then suddenly one of the three walls, I think there was three walls guarding this giant compound, which is about 3-4 square miles or 6 or 7 square kilometers, whatever it is. And suddenly you found out that somebody had broken in, and then you took your chance and in you went as well.
Well, we'd spent most of the day outside, and one of the most disturbing memories I have of that day is that we were 50 meters from the outside of the wall, and one of the cameramen, Jim Foster, was looking around a corner, and there was a man right next to him who was shot through the head, and there was so much blood on Jim. I thought Jim had been shot. Garwin, my other cameraman, was just behind him, and a lot of this man's brain matter ended up on his camera. And he wasn't actually even shot by a sniper. He was shot by a fellow opposition fighter, because it was so chaotic and so disorganized, and they were so frantic that things were going off all over the place. And at that stage, my editor said, "We think you're too close. It's far too dangerous. You need to get back." And we pulled back and sort of took a bit of a breather at that stage. And the opposition fighters told us, "We've broken through the north gate." We were actually at the south gate. And I didn't believe them at first, because everything was so chaotic. I couldn't really contemplate them being able to break through this really secure, the most secure part of the capital. But we decided we needed to go and check it out. So we raced round there, a mixture of following rebel fighters. People were very welcoming and giving us lifts. We went to the West Gate by accident, which was very, very insecure. There was lots of fighting, and they said, no, you can't. It's not ready now. But you go around that other side, you'll get in. And we walked around, and there was this flood of people going in and coming out. It was just it was like an open house, and the main wall was just smashed down, absolutely smashed down, and we just kept on running in. And suddenly we found ourselves in front of that very iconic statue, which probably everyone remembers, of the clenched fist holding the American fighter. And people were just going bonkers in there.
Looting, having fun, genuine anger. I mean, I saw a picture of a bust of Gaddafi being kicked, symbolically kicked by people. What did you find when you went in there? Did you go into the inner sanctum, to his rooms, to his tunnels, to his bedroom? Gaddafi's, that is.
Most of the time I stood outside and watched them. We were broadcasting live to show people what was happening. And they were just, as you said, doing a mixture of crazy things. There was huge amount of victory. There's a real smell, a real feeling of victory. There was trampling all over their dictator's home.
Yes.
And just that, it was incredibly symbolic, standing on top of the statue near where he delivered so many of his speeches. They set fire to the tent where he'd entertained world leaders. The building where he'd entertained Jacob Zuma had been already destroyed by NATO jets, absolutely flattened. There nothing there, just a pile of rubble. All this was massively symbolic for
symbolic desecration of their leader's property.
It was like this was really putting to bed the lie that he was in charge. Because if he was in charge, all these hundreds of people wouldn't be in there trampling all over. They were rifling through everything and taking whatever they could. I mean, in some cases, just wanton vandalism. They went, we saw lots of, because there's a whole community that lives there as well, apart from the Gaddafi family, who had big houses. But they had lots of people workers who lived there. They went through all those houses, just trashing them, pulling down cupboards, throwing teddy bears everywhere, pulling out personal things. Didn't appear to be much evidence in those cases of looting, but just destruction. But of the Gaddafi households themselves, they were just pillaging everything, taking whatever, lots of weapons being stolen. and just wanton vandalism as well.
And of course, the famous incident of the hat, which we'll come back to. But let's just leave the contemporary side of this interview now and go back a little bit. You're African, aren't you? Your roots are African.
I felt African for an awful long time because I was brought up in Nigeria, Zambia, and I went to school in what was then Rhodesia. I went back to England when I was 17 and didn't feel at all. I felt very strange, although I am British and have got a British passport. I felt very African and missed it for an awful long time. But then when I realised I spent more time in England, all my children were born in England, I felt as though I couldn't keep on calling myself African, although I feel very bonded to the continent and always wanted to come back here.
Which you've done, of course, because after you left Libya, I received an email from you when you got the first contact with the outside world, outside of Sky News. You went into Tunisia, you sent me an email, and then from there you went to Edinburgh to receive an award, and then you scooped up your husband and your 4 children and you moved to Johannesburg, to Bryanston, Johannesburg, and that's now your base.
Yeah, and it feels very familiar, even though I've never lived in South Africa. It just feels very cosy.
Yeah, cosy is not one of the words that I would describe Johannesburg as. Energetic, slightly dangerous, a little bit edgy, a good place to be, I think, generally, as all South Africa is, provided you obey a few rules. But your move into journalism these days, as we were discussing again earlier off air, very, very difficult for young people to get into a profession like this. You're an inspiration to lots of people. There will be boys and girls out there now saying, crikey, Alex Crawford, that's what I want to do. How difficult is it today for someone to do that? And how did you become a journalist?
Well, I first of all, feel very embarrassed when you say things like that, because it feels odd to hear that being told about myself. I feel as though I've spent most of my life just trying to realise a few fairly modest ambitions. One was to be a foreign correspondent, and it took me an awful long time to do it.
Yeah, but let's dispel a few of those myths now. You are famous. I mean, you were joking with me earlier on. You said your office, your colleagues in both London and in Joburg are saying, well, what are you doing in Cape Town with a community radio station? We've got Harper's looking for a photo shoot. You're supposed to be editing a documentary. You're going to New York in 2 days' time to receive, hopefully, an Emmy Award and that sort of thing. So you are famous. But it didn't start like that, did it? You started in community radio.
Yeah, I always wanted to be a journalist. And the very first thing I did, in fact, my very first work experience was in South Africa. I worked on the Rand Daily Mail, just doing work experience and feeling incredibly overawed. I was still at school. I was about 16, I think, and just thinking, oh my gosh, I'd just love to do this. It was and I went round with the crime reporter who did 3. And went to see the Soweto police guy, I think, who told her that it had been quite a quiet night because there were only 3 rapes and 2 murders that night. And thinking, whoa, I just thought it was fantastically exciting. I got taken on by Thompson Regional Newspapers, in my days off, I'd worked on community radio at the hospital radio, and just thought, I remember my mother saying, you're never going to make any money like this, and feeling really outraged that anyone would want to make money because it was such a fun job. And I think that's, if there was any advice I'd give to anyone, which is the sort of the advice that my father gave me, which you don't do anything for money. You've got to do it because you really want to do it and you really love it, because there's nothing worse than doing a job that you don't like.
Yeah, fame and money, of course, have followed your diligence, your hard work, your passion, your enthusiasm for this profession. You've now got to make a decision, I suppose. You've got to say to yourself, well, how far do I go? I don't want to get into the argument that has been raging in a couple of the English newspapers about sexism, but you're a mother of 4, and your children in one of the newspapers said, I'd rather my mum was a dinner lady rather than on Sky News. That must tug at your heartstrings occasionally.
Yeah. I think it's the same for every working mother. I don't think it can be different for any working mother the world over. That it's always a struggle leaving your children, and they will always want more than you can actually physically give. Even if I was at home all day long, which I do when I'm on the holidays or whatever, I can never give them enough. But you have to, we've reached a stage now. My mother has spent most of her life trying to ensure that her two daughters could do what they wanted to do, whether that was stay at home and be a homemaker or have a career or work or do whatever, be a rocket scientist or an astronaut or whatever. Are we all going to turn back the clock now and say, I think feminism is about deciding what you want to do, whatever you think that role is, being at home or pursuing a job. I hope I can be a role model to my three daughters as well as my son. But I hope, when my girls grow up and take up jobs, that they can follow their dreams, whatever it is, and no one's going to ask them, do you think, or make them feel guilty for leaving their own children just to pursue a dream.
Is sexism alive and well and living in the broadcasting and journalism industry?
So. Don't you? I think so.
No, Sky News is particularly good. I mean, there we were sitting this morning having a cup of tea and watching Sky News' Emma Heard reporting on Cameron and Hague and Sarkozy going into Tripoli. Sky News is particularly good at splitting the sexes.
I think so.
Equally down the middle.
I think they are. I think things have really changed in the 20 years or so that I've been with them. That's not just Sky that's changed. The whole world has changed. Everything's different. When I first started in broadcasting, there was very little maternity rights. There was very little part-time work for mothers when they first return. There was no paternity rights. Things have entirely changed in 2 decades or so in Britain, and for the better. And now the opportunities are there. It's a fantastic time to be a journalist, never mind a female journalist, but great opportunities for, if you can get the opportunities, which is what it's all about. Once you get the opportunities, making them pay. There are plenty of really good journalists out there who are women. But we're getting the opportunities now, and now you're noticing.
Is it almost an advantage? In recent shows, we've spoken to the biographer of a book called An Inconvenient Youth, the Malema biography. And I suggested to Fiona Ford, the author of that book, that perhaps being a woman was an advantage in gaining access to Malema. Was it an advantage to you in any situations over the last 20 years and men trusting you? I mean, you've got a colleague called Sam Kiley, who's a kind of beefy bloke, bald-headed, and he looks quite menacing to some people and might not be accepted by certain of his intended subjects.
I think it's a fantastic opportunity. I mean, I've never had any trouble getting an interview. That doesn't mean I've been able to get all the people I want to interview, but I've never had any, I've worked in some of the most difficult areas where women are really subjugated. The indigenous women are really subjugated and very repressed. But as a foreign woman, I'm in an entirely different category, and I use that to highlight the problems that the indigenous women have, I hope. I think it's a fantastic advantage being a woman in even in the Arab culture. People are generally, the world over, feel less threatened by a woman, feel much, you're dealing mostly with men, even when they're militants or freedom fighters or terrorists, they generally feel much better disposed towards a female and less intimidated by a female, and also quite respectful, that especially if you've gone out of your way or gone to difficult areas. I mean, many times when I was in Afghanistan, they would say, we've never had any women here, never mind a foreign woman, and we want you to know that we do respect you. We're not asking you to cover your head because we disrespect you.
But you did, didn't you, in so many cases?
Well, a lot of the time I went in a burqa because that was a the only way I could get in unnoticed, because as soon as they saw a foreigner, that would raise alarm bells all over the place, and people would be sending out their spies to alert the various authorities, be they Afghan or NATO or army or intelligence agents, that a foreigner was there in an area they weren't meant to be. So I often went in under burqa, and when they allowed me to take off the burqa, I'd put my scarf on, because that is the culture. If you don't cover yourself, a lot of the times I'd be wearing huge scarves wrapped around my body, and my Afghan producer would say, cover yourself up. And I'd say, I thought I was. And he'd say, no, you can see a little bit of your jeans underneath. Cover. Yeah, it's just a different culture. It's very different to the way other different cultures react, particularly in the West.
How did you feel when the leader of Pakistan was assassinated?
Well, I was absolutely stunned, because she was a very charismatic woman, and I'd interviewed her several times. Once before she was leader of the opposition, when she was fighting for, she first came to Nottingham when I was just a young cub reporter on Radio Nottingham, and I was really struck by her. She was very charismatic and very bright. And very presentable, which also I think helped in that part of the world. And I'd interviewed her more recently when she returned to Pakistan, and I thought she represented quite a good future for Pakistan.
That's why I asked the question, because it seems to be a great step backwards. If she had actually managed to stay around for a few more years, she knew she was going to be killed. I always got that impression that she knew she was going to be assassinated. Yeah,
I think she knew she was in a great deal of danger. But I used to think back, after seeing the sequence of events, because after she was assassinated, then, her husband is now president. A whole series of unforeseen events happened as a result of this one person's death. And poor old Pakistan has really suffered. The whole nation has suffered. The whole world has, actually. It had an impact, trickle effect down on the whole world's security. And, I sort of think if that hadn't happened, how things would have been very different, I think.
That podcast was proudly brought to you in association with sharenet.co.za. Visit strictlybusinesspodcast.com and subscribe to receive exclusive content straight to your inbox.